Today I wanted to talk about some tips for Rockwork that I have found helpful so that we can try to avoid using these kinds of pieces. I'll try to give a bunch of helpful tips, and I'll also let you know the pieces that are most common that I'm always running out of that I would recommend you picking up as many of as you can if you want to have Rockwork similar to this. All right, first off, we're going to be talking about this little guy here. So some of these examples that I'm going to use might be a little bit exaggerated and might seem obvious, but hopefully you can take the principles and just run with them and apply them to wherever you need in your builds. But here I wanted to talk about avoiding too much flat space, particularly on the sides of slopes. So generally what we do, right, is we just go and start stacking up a bunch of slopes, and you probably wouldn't generally end up with an area quite as big as this. It might be a little bit smaller, but as a principle, I try to just avoid showing larger open areas that are exposed like this. It just doesn't flow well. The whole goal with making my Rockwork is trying to make natural looking, smooth flowing shapes. And this is kind of the opposite of that. So a bit of a more subtle way where you might see something like this is maybe even somewhere like this, where you just have this very large space that you can see on the side of the slope. Now, it's not necessarily as wide, but it's more long, but it still applies. If there's just too much of the side of a slope visible, then it just gets a little bit boring and repetitive, I feel. So try to avoid just having these open gaps on the sides of your slopes that are too big. Also, in general, I try to avoid random jut outs and indentations that just don't make sense. There might be situations for it, but as a general rule, I try to avoid stuff like this. Let me show you an example in practice what that might look like. So right here, this I would say is not ideal when you have this slope right in there that is just indented, but on either side of it, you just have these slopes that stick out a little bit further on either side of this one right in the middle. So that I would say is not ideal. It would be more ideal to have this be a little bit more flush, so it just is a nice natural curve instead of this strange indentation. There might be situations for that, but that's kind of an example of what it might look like in practice. And then right back here, I would generally say this is a little bit too much of the side of slope exposed for my liking. Normally I would want to put something here that covers it a little bit more. Some spaces are tricky, and this probably was one of them, but there's an example of what too much slope sometimes might look like. Too much side of the slope, at least. Maybe I should clarify that. Too much side of the slope, that's what it might look like. All right, so let's talk about another scenario. Let's say we have this little cliff piece and it's kind of rounding and curving a corner, and we just have this big space that we want to fill. Maybe we'll say, oh, let's just grab this large slope and just put it in there, and hey, there we go. Now our corner is filled. You can do that, but in general, I try to avoid using 2 by 2 wide slopes. So I actually have I have a large bag full of them, and these almost never get used. I tend to try to focus on more smaller pieces, make things more intricate, and this kind of breaks my rule of too much flat, too much of one thing in one place. So in general, I avoid 2 wide slopes. So then you might be thinking, okay, how can we fill this? So the next point is actually kind of twofold. Embrace wedge slopes. So there's all sorts of different kinds. There's all sorts of different kinds of wedge slopes, but these are very, very useful for rounding corners and just adding some interest because they have this this corner right here. This corner right here is quite similar. I can't quite recreate it perfectly, but it's quite similar to something like this. But it's very difficult to fill this gap between this point and this point to make that little triangle. It's difficult to fill, and you're able to get that with wedge slopes. So that's very useful to utilize. Even the curved ones, as opposed to like the straight edge ones, they are all so useful. So really embrace using these, start collecting these so you have them to use, and also start using them as snot techniques here. I would say this looks a lot more interesting than just having this right there. Automatically, that just improves this whole thing and it looks so much more interesting. So here's another example of what the corner could kind of look like using some of these wedge bricks or wedge slopes on snot techniques. So I have found that this 1x1 by, I don't even know how tall it is, this piece is one of the most useful pieces for rock work that I found. In general, you want to go with 1 wide, everything pretty much. 1 wide slopes, 1 wide snot pieces, just because it's a lot easier to work with. And then also for snot pieces, we want to try to use a lot of brackets. So these are nice to use in combination with these because there is a half of a plate offset that is just very nice for getting some more intricate details and curves going in different places. So, but again, in general, you want to focus on using 1 wide brackets just because you'll be able to fit them in smaller spaces and get more details just by using these in, smaller spaces. So focus on using snot pieces and intertwining snot techniques with just normal building upright. As you can see how I've kind of done that here, and it looks pretty seamless in my opinion. So as opposed to just doing everything all from the bottom up like this, I would say that this one on the left looks a lot more interesting and appealing than the one here on the right. So here's an example of a little rock segment that you could add on to something that uses most of these techniques. So it is using this snot brick here in the middle, and it is using both snot sideways pieces here, but also just upright, and even pieces on the front here. So it's using lots of 1 by pieces. You're not going to see any 2 wide pieces here. Except maybe some plates, but those are just for detailing and just making things stick out a little bit more. This looks good, but one thing I think I would change, this corner right here, kind of what we were talking about earlier with those wedge plates, how that triangle, that corner is filled in, and we want to avoid as much flat space as possible. So this is acceptable, but it could be better. So I am just going to take this off, bring in this little bracket with a plate on it, and there, all of a sudden, this gap is filled in a little bit more. It's a little bit more interesting because there's a fun technique there, and this empty triangle is now a little bit smaller. So that's just an example of a way that I'm using all these techniques, pretty much keeping the flat spaces small, using brackets, using snot bricks, and using lots of 1 by slopes, curved slopes, and you can get something that looks, in my opinion, pretty cool. You really do want to use a variety of curved slopes as well as just normal straight slopes, as that will add a lot of interest into all these builds. You can see there's curved ones over here and then mixed with lots of straight, and it just makes for lots of interest, in my opinion. So try to vary it up, try to get a good variety of curved and straight slopes in your collection. Also, you can see just how many 1 by 1 cheese slopes I'm using all over the place here. Here's a 1 by 2, but they're all cheese slopes. Those you can never have enough of. They are the best piece for just filling in little corners that just need something. So make sure you have quite a few of those as well in your collection. Now we're just going to talk about some of the pieces that you will want to have for all of this rock building, starting with cheese slopes. So these, like I just said, are super useful just for filling in really small spots. You can never have enough of these. You definitely want to make sure you have a bunch of these in the correct colors. Next, we're going to talk about curved slopes. You want to have a bunch of these in different sizes and shapes. They are super useful. Again, one wide ones, you just want to have a bunch of just for filling in. And just for going along with all your straight slopes, your 1x straight slopes, these are going to be super useful. You can never have enough of these. And that also goes for like slightly larger ones, just like this. Next may be a little obvious, but we want to get a bunch of just 1 wide slopes in all sorts of different sizes. So 2 tall, 1 tall, different lengths, and 3 tall. So just get a wide variety. You're going to be able to use all of them. And of course, along with that, we're just going to tend to avoid these 2 wide slopes just because they're not exactly the style we're going for. And of course, we want to get a bunch of wedge slopes and bricks, whatever these are called. Wedge slopes, I guess. I guess this one here is maybe more of a wedge brick. I don't know exactly what that one's called. But these kinds of pieces in all sorts of different shapes and sizes, maybe even some bigger ones for the occasional time that you'll want to use them. But these, honestly, I wish I had more of, and I will be needing to get more of, but very, very useful. Don't discount these. These are often taken for granted, but they're super useful. And of course, our brackets and our snot pieces, you can never have enough of, so just keep a good amount of those on hand, especially these where you can add snot pieces flush to the bottom of the stud, as opposed to ones like this where it is slightly lifted. So these ones are ideal for building with rocks. And then brackets, just make sure you have a bunch of them in a bunch of different sizes. All right, and then these are some more, I guess I would call them kind of filler items, but you are probably going to be using a lot of 1x1 plates and tiles and 1x2 plates and tiles, just for filling in some areas. You can see here on this one, that is a tile right there, and then down here are some plates. So these you tend to use a lot of when you're doing this really fine detail, especially with like brackets and sideways pieces. You'll need lots of like filler to make something a little bit longer, or, you know, whatever it's for. So you will want to have quite a few of these smaller plates and tiles. And lastly, these aren't used quite as often, but on occasion it's nice to have some wedge plates just for some nice little angles or filling in some nice little corners. And then the 2 pieces that I never seem to have enough of because I'm using so many of, they seem to be 2 of the most useful pieces, are first this little 2x2 with the corner kind of cut out. This piece is a lot more useful than you would think. It happens pretty frequently where you're trying to make a corner, and like an inverted corner, and you just don't know how to fill it in. Like where this one is the opposite, where it's kind of a corner going this way. Sometimes there might be one going the opposite way. I don't know if that makes sense. But this piece is so useful. I never seem to have enough of them. The other piece are these really small 1x2 by 2/3 curved slopes. Super useful for really intricate rock work and detailing. These I would have a ton of in dark gray or whatever color you're building your rocks in, just because they are so very useful. So you can see I just took this little panel from right there, so now it's back in its home spot and it looks a little bit better. But thanks for watching, guys. That's going to do it for this video. Hopefully that was helpful with some of these tips for how to do some of this rock work. Let me know if you find it helpful and if you use it for any of your builds. I'd love to know that. And if you want any other tutorials or similar kinds of rock videos or videos on any other sorts of techniques, let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the next video.